The Duke collapsed at his own ball, and every lord in the room froze. Only the housemaid moved, kneeling beside him with a copper coin and a steady whisper. What no one knew, she had been waiting 2 years to stand over him like that, and the bargain he was about to offer her would change both their lives forever. The crystal chandeliers of Oakhaven House blazed like 100 small suns, throwing trembling light across the polished marble floor. Outside, a thick London fog pressed against the tall windows, but inside, the air was warm with perfume, beeswax candles, and the soft hum of a string quartet. Carriages had been arriving at the gas-lit curb since 7 o'clock, and now, just past 9, the grand ballroom of the Duke of Pemberton was packed with the cream of English society. Lords in black tailcoats and crisp white cravats spoke in low, important voices. Ladies in silk gowns of plum, ivory, and pale blue floated past on the arms of their husbands, their hair pinned with pearls and their cheeks flushed from the heat of the room. A footman in green livery moved between them with a silver tray of champagne flutes. The whole evening had been arranged for one man, and one man only. Duke Silas Ashford, 27 years old, had come home. For 3 years he had been gone, charting islands no Englishman had ever set foot upon, dragging his name across the front page of every paper from Bristol to Edinburgh. The newspapers had crowned him the modern Magellan. Mothers spoke of him to their daughters, old admirals raised glasses to him in their clubs, and tonight, at last, he stood at the top of the wide marble staircase in a deep blue coat with brass buttons, his dark hair brushed back, his sun-browned face a strange contrast to the pale gentry below. A hush spread across the ballroom as he lifted a crystal flute of fine Spanish sherry. "My friends," he began, and his voice carried easily, the way a captain's voice carries across a deck. "I have crossed 3 oceans and walked through forests that have no names. I have slept beneath stars our maps have never charted. But I tell you tonight, with all my heart, there is no welcome in this wide world to match the welcome of one's own country." He stopped. For a half-second, no one noticed. He simply paused, as though searching for the next word. His glass tilted a little in his hand. Then his face went the color of old parchment. "Forgive me," he said, very quietly. The crystal flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble. A woman near the front gasped. The Duke staggered, one gloved hand reaching for the wall, and then his knees gave way, and he crashed against the heavy velvet curtain by the staircase, dragging it half from its rod as he sank to the floor. The ballroom erupted. Ladies shrieked. A gentleman shouted for a doctor. The string quartet broke off mid-note. People pressed forward, then pressed back, none of them quite knowing what to do with their hands. The Dowager Countess of Wexley fainted into the arms of her companion. Somewhere, a glass dropped and broke. In all of this, no one saw the girl move. Lyra Thorne was 25 years old and had been a housemaid in this house for nearly 2 years. She stood just inside the servants' door, holding a silver tray of small pastries and tiny cuts of cured ham. Her dress was plain black wool, her apron stiff white linen, and her brown hair was pinned tight beneath a small white cap. No one had looked at her all evening. No one ever did. But when the Duke fell, her tray dropped from her hands without her even thinking about it. The pastries scattered across the floor. She stepped over them. She pushed past a gentleman in a silk waistcoat who was shouting for water. She did not run. She moved with the steady, unhurried purpose of a person who had seen something like this before. When she reached the Duke, she knelt down in her plain black skirts as though he were any man in any street. A great fat banker tried to pull her back by the shoulder. "Girl, leave him. The physician is coming." She shook him off without looking up. The Duke's eyes were open, but they were not seeing the ballroom. They were rolling slowly, as if he were watching something far away. His lips had gone a strange shade of blue at the edges. A thin line of sweat ran down his temple. Lyra reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a small, dull copper coin. She placed it carefully against the side of his neck, just below the jaw, and pressed. With her other hand, she took his hand and began to count under her breath, a slow, even count, in and out, the way a sailor counts the swell of the sea. 1, hold, 2, hold, 3, hold. The Duke's chest, which had been heaving in short, panicked jerks, began to slow. His blue lips parted. He drew one long, shaking breath, and then another. A whisper passed around the room. "Who is she? What is she doing? Get her away from him." But the Duke, with the last clear thought left to him before the darkness took him, turned his head a quarter of an inch and looked straight at Lyra, his eyes focused. For one strange moment, in a ballroom full of dukes and earls and the wealthiest men in England, he saw only the housemaid. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Lyra read the shape of the word, and her whole face went pale. He had said, "Thorn." She had not told a single soul in this house her surname. 2 days later, the great mahogany bedchamber of the Duke of Pemberton was as quiet as a church. Heavy green curtains were drawn against the morning light. A coal fire muttered to itself in the marble grate. The air smelled of camphor, beeswax, and something sour underneath, the sharp, sour smell of a man who has been sweating for 30 hours. Dr. Edmund Whitcomb, physician to half the peerage of England, stood at the foot of the four-poster bed and stroked his grey side whiskers. On the bed lay the Duke, propped against a mountain of feather pillows, his face the colour of candle tallow. His dark hair was damp and stuck to his forehead. His eyes were closed, but the lids fluttered as though he were watching something behind them. "It is most singular," the doctor murmured to the Duke's elderly aunt, Lady Margaret, who sat in a chair by the window. "Most singular indeed. The pulse is steady, the fever is mild, and yet he cannot rise. He speaks of ships, he speaks of reefs and rolling decks. I confess myself baffled, your ladyship." "You are the finest physician in London, Edmund," said Lady Margaret in a thin, tight voice. "Surely there is something." "I have applied 6 leeches behind the ears. I have ordered a strict diet of beef tea and weak claret. I have prescribed bed rest for a fortnight. Beyond that," he spread his hands, "I have written to a colleague in Edinburgh." A small, dry sound came from the bed. The Duke had laughed, or tried to. "Ghost ships," he whispered. "Tell him there are ghost ships in the wallpaper." Lady Margaret pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth. The doctor cleared his throat, snapped his black bag shut, and bowed himself out of the room, promising to return in the evening. Lady Margaret rose, kissed her nephew's damp forehead, and followed him, dabbing at her eyes. The door clicked shut, the fire popped. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then the small servant's door behind the wardrobe opened on its silent hinges, and Lyra slipped through, a brass coal scuttle on her arm. She went first to the grate, knelt, and made a small show of stirring the coals with the iron poker, in case anyone came back. Then she rose, crossed to the bed, and looked down at him. The Duke had opened his eyes. "You came back," he said very quietly. "I work here, Your Grace." "You know what I mean." She set the scuttle down. From the deep pocket of her apron, she drew a small green glass bottle, no bigger than her thumb, stoppered with a twist of waxed cloth. 3 drops on the tongue, she said, every 4 hours. Not water, not tea. It will spoil in tea. What is it? Ginger, sea kelp, 2 other things you would not know the names of. She paused. It will not cure you. It will let you sit up. It will let you think. He took the bottle in a hand that trembled. And the cure? There is no cure in this country, she said. What struck you down was not an English poison. He waited. Lyra glanced once at the door, then sat down on the edge of the bed, which was a thing no maid had ever done in this house in 200 years. The tribes of the Eastern Archipelago you mapped last spring, she said. They call it the navigator's blindness. It is given to men who see too much. The visions, the ghost ships, the rolling decks, those are not madness. The poison shows you things that are not in this room. My father wrote of it in his journals. The Duke went very still. Your father? Captain Elias Thorne. He closed his eyes. For a moment she thought he might be slipping under again. Then he opened them, and they were sharp, sharper than they had been since the ball. Thorne went down with the Persephone off Java 6 years ago. He did not go down, said Lyra. Or if he did not stay down. I have his last letter. It was written 4 years after the Persephone was lost. And I have his journals, all 12 of them, in a trunk under a floorboard in a boarding house in Wapping. The Duke stared at her. Why are you a housemaid in my home? Because the Board of Admiralty struck my father's name from the rolls and left my mother and me to starve. And because, Your Grace, you were the last man to see him alive. I have been waiting in this house for 1 year and 11 months to find out what you did to him. The coal fire cracked once, very loud, in the silence. The Duke did not answer at once. He lay there, staring up at the green silk canopy above the bed, and the silence stretched so long that Lyra began to wonder if the poison had taken his tongue. A cinder fell in the grate. Somewhere far below stairs, a kitchen maid was singing. I did nothing to him, Silas said at last. That is what I am afraid of. He turned his head on the pillow. His sun-browned face was thinner than it had been at the ball, the cheekbones sharper, the dark eyes deeper set. He looked older by a decade. Tell me what you mean by that, Miss Thorne. I mean that my father wrote to the Admiralty 3 times from a port I cannot read the name of, asking for relief. I mean that you were the senior officer on that station. I mean that no relief was ever sent. She kept her voice level, the way one keeps a cup level when carrying it down a flight of stairs. I do not know whether you read the letters. I do not know whether they were kept from you. I have come into this house to find out. He closed his eyes again. She thought he was gathering strength to speak, but when he opened them, there were tears standing in the corners, which startled her more than anything that had happened in the last 2 days. I read one of them, he said. She did not breathe. One letter reached me at Singapore. It came in a packet of dispatches in the spring of '46. I was 21 years old, and I had just been given my first independent command. Your father wrote that he had found something. He did not say what. He asked for a sloop and 40 men to be sent to a position he gave in coded numbers. His voice caught. I gave the order to send the sloop. 2 weeks later, I gave the order to recall it. Why? Because a senior captain told me Thorne had gone mad, that his coded numbers were nonsense, that he had been chasing a fever dream for 2 years and was wasting Her Majesty's ships. Silas drew a slow, shaking breath. I was 21. He was 60. I believed him. Lyra's hands had closed into fists in her lap without her knowing it. The captain who told you that, she said. What was his name? Augustus Hale. She nodded, very slowly. He is now first mate aboard your own ship, the Aurora. I have seen his name on the crew lists in your study. The Duke went still in a different way now, the stillness of a man whose mind has begun moving very fast behind a quiet face. Yes, he said. He is. For a long minute neither of them spoke. The fire muttered. Outside the heavy curtains, a hansom cab rattled past on the cobbles of Oakhaven Square, the horse's hooves muffled by the morning fog. "Miss Thorne," the Duke said at last, "I want to make you a proposal. Listen to it before you answer." "Go on." "The Board of Admiralty will hear of my collapse within the week, if they have not heard already. There are men on that board who have wanted my ships and my charts and my title since the day I came home. If they learn that I cannot stand without help, that I see things that are not there, they will declare me unfit. They will strip me of my command. They will give my expedition to another man, very likely to Hale, and within a month every map I have made will be in the hands of a rival shipping house." "That is your trouble, Your Grace, not mine." "It is yours if you wish to find your father." She said nothing. "You have the journals, I have the ships. You know what the poison is and what holds it back. I know the waters where he was last seen. Neither of us alone can finish this. Together we can." He shifted against the pillows, wincing. "I am offering you a place beside me, not as a maid, as my private secretary, with quarters near my own and access to my study, my charts, and my correspondence. I will pay you £40 a year. When the Aurora sails in the spring, you will sail with her." She drew in a breath. £40 was 4 times what she earned in this house. "Your Grace, a young woman as a duke's private secretary, living under his roof. There is not a drawing room in London that will not call it scandal. There is not a drawing room in London I give a farthing for. Your aunt, my aunt, will be told you are the daughter of a fallen naval officer to whom I owe a debt of honor, which, as it happens, is the truth." His dark eyes held hers. "I am not offering you a kindness, Miss Thorne. I am offering you a bargain. You keep me on my feet. You keep my secret. I take you to the edge of the world to find what your father found. Yes or no?" Lyra looked down at the little green bottle in his hand and then at the man who had, 6 years ago, called back the ship that might have saved her father. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "When we find him, you will look him in the eye and tell him what you told me. Every word of it." The Duke held out his hand. After a moment, she took it. A week passed, and London turned colder. The fog that rolled up from the river was the yellow, choking kind that made gas lamps look like drowned moons and turned every passerby into a black shape with no face. The papers called it a particular. The dock workers called it worse. By Thursday morning, it lay so thick over Oakhaven Square that Lyra, drawing back the heavy curtains in the Duke's study, could not see the railings of the garden. She wore a new dress now, grey wool, cut plain but well, with a small white collar and cuffs of fine linen. Her hair was still pinned up, but no cap sat on it. Lady Margaret had taken the news of her appointment with the stiff, frozen politeness of a woman who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and had sailed for Bath the following morning, leaving the house to her nephew and his scandal. The Duke was at his writing desk, signing a letter, when Lyra came in with a tray of strong black tea and the little green bottle. 3 drops, she said, setting it down. 3 drops, he repeated, and obeyed. He could sit now without the room turning. He could walk the length of the long gallery if she walked beside him. But the visions had not gone. They had only changed. The ghost ships of the first days had grown quieter, more particular, more strange. He had told her 2 nights ago that the pattern of the parquet floor in the dining room looked to him like a chain of low islands seen from the masthead at dawn. She had written it down in a small leather notebook. She did not yet know why. "We must go to the docks today," he said, folding the letter. "I have had word from a man named Pegg. He keeps a chandler's shop near Wapping Stairs and has done business with the Aurora these 8 years. He will not put what he knows in a letter." "Are you well enough?" "No," he said, "but it cannot wait. Hale has been seen twice in a coffee-house in Mincing Lane in the company of a gentleman called Vivian Crowe." "Who is Crowe?" "A shipping magnate. 2 of his vessels are loading for Java this month. If my charts reach his hands, he will be in the Eastern Archipelago before I have raised an anchor." She nodded and went to fetch their coats. They took a hansom cab from the rank in Park Lane. The Duke wore a long black greatcoat with the collar turned up and a low-brimmed hat that hid most of his face. Lyra wore a dark blue cloak over the grey dress, the hood drawn forward. They did not speak as the cab rolled east through Holborn and down towards the river, and the city changed around them as it went. The wide white squares of Mayfair, the busy print shops of Fleet Street, the narrowing lanes of the old city, and at last the close, dirty, sour-smelling streets of the docks, where every second house was a public house and every third man was a sailor. The cabman stopped at the end of Wapping High Street and would go no further. They paid him and walked. It was here that the trouble began. The fog at the river was different from the fog in the squares. It came off the brown water in slow, heavy rolls, and it carried with it the smell of tar and rotten rope and the bitter coal smoke from 100 steam packets moored along the wharves. Silas walked steadily for perhaps 100 yards. Then he stopped. "What is it?" she said. He did not answer. He was staring at the cobbles in front of his boots, as if the street had fallen away. Silas. She had never used his name before. It came out of her mouth before she could catch it. He looked up at her with eyes that were not quite focused, and she understood at once. The toxin had found something here. The fog, perhaps, or the salt in the air, or the closeness of the water. Whatever it was, he was seeing it again. "There is a reef," he said quietly. 3 points off the starboard bow. Black coral. We must come about." She took his arm and slid it through her own, as though they were sweethearts strolling out on a winter morning. To anyone watching, they were a young couple lost in the fog. She felt the tremor in him through the wool of his sleeve. "Lean on me," she said into his ear, very low. "Walk where I walk. There is no reef. There is a coil of rope on your left and a cart on your right. Step over the rope. 3 paces. Now 4. He went where she steered him. A pair of dockhands carrying a crate of tea between them passed on the other side of the road and never looked twice. Peg's chandlery was a narrow doorway between a sailmaker's and a public house called the Prospect. The bell above the door clanked as they entered. The shop smelled of pitch and hemp and pipe smoke. A small, wiry man with one milky eye looked up from behind a counter heaped with brass fittings. He saw the Duke. His face went grey. "Your Grace," he whispered, "you should not have come. Hale was here yesterday. He knows you are alive." They left Peg's shop with their heads down and their secret heavier than when they had come in. Hale had not only been there, he had bought 3 things, the chandler said in a hoarse whisper over the brass-fitting counter. A length of best manila rope, a bullseye lantern, and a brace of pistols with powder enough for a small war. He had paid in gold sovereigns and had asked, very quietly, whether anyone had seen a young brown-haired woman in the company of the Duke. Peg had said no. Peg had then locked his door for the first time in 15 years. By the time the hansom cab brought them back to Oakhaven Square, the gas lamps were being lit along the railings, and a thin, cold rain had begun to fall. Silas was steady on his feet again, the visions having loosened their grip the further they got from the river, but his face was set in a way Lyra had not seen before. "He means to come tonight," he said as they crossed the hall. "He cannot leave the journals in this house another day, not now that he knows I am alive to read them." "Then we must not be in this house tonight." "No, we must not." They moved quickly after that. Lyra packed a single carpet bag with the things that mattered, a change of linen, her father's last letter folded inside a Bible, the little green bottle and 3 spares she had prepared in the still room. Silas went to his study and emptied a hidden drawer beneath the writing desk, drawing out a leather portfolio bound with black ribbon. The journals of Captain Elias Thorne were inside it. He had moved them from her boarding house in Wapping the morning after she had told him where they were, with her permission and her thanks. By 10 o'clock the house was quiet. The footmen had been sent to their beds early. The cook was asleep in her chair by the kitchen range. Silas had told his butler that he would not be disturbed before noon and had locked the study door from the outside, leaving a single candle burning in the window as though he was still at work. They were not at work. They were in Lyra's small room at the back of the third floor, fully dressed, listening. The clock on the landing struck midnight. At 10 minutes past, a sound came from below. It was the smallest possible sound, a soft scrape, the kind a knife makes when it is being slid between a sash window and its frame. The scullery, Lyra thought. They had come up through the area steps. She put her hand on Silas's wrist. He nodded once. He had heard it too. They did not run. They had agreed not to run. Running, in a house full of stairs and uncarpeted boards, was the surest way to be caught. They moved instead, in their stockinged feet, along the back corridor and down the narrow servant stair, the one with the green baize door at the bottom. From below came another sound now, the soft thud of boots on stone, and a man's voice, low. Up the back, quick about it. There were 3 of them at least, possibly 4. Mudlarks, the Duke had called them, when she described the kind of men Hale would hire. The wiry, half-starved boys and grown men who picked a living out of the Thames mud and would cut a throat for a sovereign. They were already inside. Silas led her not to the front door, but through a small panelled passage behind the dining room and into the mews at the rear of the house, where the horses were kept. He had spoken to no one about this route. The stable boy was asleep in his loft above the carriage house, and the carriage horses snorted softly in their stalls. They slipped out through the side gate into the lane. The rain had thickened. The lane smelled of wet straw. A 4-wheeler was waiting at the corner of South Audley Street with its lamps turned down. Silas had paid the driver £2 in advance, and another 2 were promised on arrival. They climbed in. The driver clicked his tongue, and they pulled away into the rain, and behind them, in a tall house in Oakhaven Square, the single candle in the study window burned on for another half hour before a heavy boot kicked the locked door open, and 3 men found nothing inside but an empty desk. They did not stop in London. They went straight to Paddington and there boarded the night mail train for the West Country, paying for a private second-class compartment because a first-class one would be remembered. The carriage smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. The lamps were turned down low. Lyra sat opposite Silas with her cloak pulled around her shoulders and watched the dark fields of Berkshire roll past the rain-streaked window. He spoke at last when they were somewhere west of Reading, and he did not look at her when he spoke. "There is a thing I have not told you, and I had meant to tell you before this." She waited. "The order to recall the sloop in 46. The one Hale persuaded me to give. I signed it, Lyra. But before I signed it, your father wrote to me a second time. I never opened that letter. It came in a packet on the morning I sailed for the Spice Islands, and I put it aside for the voyage. And then I forgot it. It was in my sea chest for 9 months. When I opened it, it was too late." The wheels rattled under them. "What did it say?" "It said he had a daughter in London, and would I see that she was safe." The train reached Truro a little before noon the next day, and a hired post-chaise carried them the last 12 miles to the coast. Silas's ancestral seat, a place called Trevarrow, stood on a finger of grey rock that ran out into the Atlantic above a small fishing village. It was not a grand house. It was a low, weather-beaten manor of granite and slate, built 3 centuries ago by a Cornish ancestor who had wanted to see the sea from every window. The Duke had not set foot in it for 11 years. An old caretaker, a man called Penrose, met them at the gate with no surprise on his face at all, as though dukes arrived without warning in carpet-bags every Tuesday. The salt wind came off the cliffs like a clean knife. By the second day, Silas could walk to the headland and back without leaning on her arm. By the third, he could read a chart for an hour at a stretch without the lines beginning to swim. Lyra had set up a kind of workroom in the old library, a long, stone-floored chamber that smelled of book dust and wood smoke, with 2 tall windows that looked straight out over the water. She had laid her father's journals out along the great oak table in the order of their dates. Silas had spread his own charts at the other end. On the morning of the fourth day, they began to put them together. Captain Thorne's journals were not what a stranger would expect. He had been a man with a clerk's neat hand and a poet's eye, and he had filled his pages with sketches of birds and shore lines and small, careful notes on the color of the water at different depths. But every fourth or fifth page carried something different, a column of numbers down the margin, a small diagram that looked at first glance like a windrose, but was not, a list of phrases in a language neither of them knew. "He was writing in two voices," Lyra said on the second morning, turning a page slowly. "One for any man who might find the journal, one for someone he trusted to read between the lines. He was writing for you. He was writing for whoever could read his stars." She tapped a page. It was a sketch of a night sky as seen from the deck of a ship, with 5 stars circled and a faint line drawn between them. Beside it, her father had written, in his small, clean hand, "The sailor's eye is never enough. One must also drink the cup." Silas frowned at it. Drink the cup. He used the phrase twice more, here and here. She turned to the relevant pages. "I thought for years it was a way of saying, take the bitter medicine. But—" She stopped. Silas was no longer looking at the journal. He was looking at the wall behind her, at nothing, and his face had gone the particular shade of gray she had learned to watch for. "How bad?" she asked. "Not bad. Different." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "There is a chain of small islands strung out between the bookcase and the window." "How many?" 5. No, 6. The 6th is smaller." She picked up her notebook and wrote it down without comment, as she had done a dozen times in the past 3 weeks. Then she turned back to her father's page, with the 5 circled stars and the line drawn between them, and she went very still. "Silas?" "Yes." "How are they arranged, the islands?" He told her. 3 close together in a curve, then a gap, then 2 more in a straight line, and a smaller one set apart to one side. She turned the journal around and slid it across the table. The 5 circled stars on her father's page were arranged in exactly the same pattern. 3 in a curve, a gap, 2 in a line, and a smaller star set apart to one side. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moaned against the window glass. A gull cried somewhere below the cliff. "It is not a poison," Lyra said slowly. "Or it is, but that is not what it is for." "Drink the cup," Silas whispered. "The tribes did not curse you. They marked you. They gave it to men who had seen too much because they wanted those men to carry the chart inside their own eyes, where it could not be stolen and could not be sold. My father," her voice caught, "my father must have taken it himself. He must have drunk the cup. That is why his letters made no sense to the Admiralty. He was not mad. He was writing down what he saw." Silas sat down very slowly in the chair opposite her. "Then the visions are coordinates." "Triggered by something. Salt air, fog, the altitude of the cliffs. We will not know what until we have charted every one of them against your own positions at sea." "It would take weeks." "It will take 3 days. I have his key. He left it in the back of the 12th journal, in a letter to me he wrote and never sent. I did not know what it was for until this moment." She slid a folded paper across to him. It was covered in her father's small, clean hand, columns of numbers paired with phrases. Black coral, 3 points off the starboard bow. A chain of low islands seen from the masthead at dawn. And so on, down the page, each phrase tied to a precise latitude and longitude. Silas looked up at her, and for the first time since the ball, he smiled. They worked through the rest of that day and far into the night. By the time the candles had burned down to stubs and a cold gray dawn was creeping over the Atlantic, they had a map. Not a perfect one. There were gaps where the visions had not yet come, and there were 2 phrases of Captain Thorne's that did not match anything Silas had seen. But the shape of the thing was there now, on a great sheet of cartridge paper spread across the oak table. A chain of islands lying some 400 miles east-southeast of a known group already on the Admiralty charts, with a deep water channel between them that was marked on no chart in England. It was, Silas said quietly, the find of the century. It was also, he said an hour later over a cup of black coffee in the cold kitchen, worth a fortune to any man who could reach it first. They left Trevorrow that afternoon. Penrose drove them down to the village in a small open trap, and from the village, a fishing smack took them around the headland to Falmouth, which was a busier port than the little harbor below the house and the place where the Aurora was at her mooring. The wind was fresh from the southwest. The water was the color of pewter. Lyra sat at the stern with the folded map inside her bodice against her ribs, and Silas sat in the bows with his face turned into the wind, looking, for the first time in weeks, like a man who knew what he was doing. The fishermen put them ashore at a small wooden jetty on the unfashionable side of the harbor, where bonded warehouses crowded along the quay, and the smell of tar and spices was thick in the air. They had agreed on the way that they would not go straight to the Aurora. They would go first to a small inn called the Pendennis Arms, where Silas's old sailing master, a man called Joss Carrick, kept a room above the bar whenever the ship was in port. Carrick was a Falmouth man, 63 years old, and had taught Silas to read a chart when Silas was 14. If anyone aboard the Aurora had stayed loyal, it would be Carrick. He was waiting for them in the back parlor of the Pendennis Arms, a great brown weathered man with a clay pipe and a sea coat the color of wet rope. He stood when they came in. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Lyra, then he looked back at Silas, and a slow grin came over his face. "So she's the one," he said. Peg sent word. "Carrick, how bad?" "Bad enough. Hale has the ship under a forged commission signed in your name. He sails on the morning tide for Java with a hold half full of trade goods and a sealed packet from a gentleman in Mincing Lane. Crew of 40. 16 of them are his own men, brought aboard in the last fortnight. 24 are yours." "Will mine fight for me?" "To the last man, your grace. They have not been paid since you took ill, and Hale has told them you are dead in a madhouse in Surrey. Show them you are neither, and they are yours." Silas drew a long breath. "Then we go now." They went down to the quay in the late afternoon, when the light was already beginning to thicken, and a curl of sea fog was creeping in past the castle. Carrick walked on Silas's left. Lyra walked on his right. He needed neither of them for his feet now, but he kept her arm linked in his all the same, and she understood why. Whatever was about to happen on that deck, he wanted every man aboard to see her standing beside him from the moment she came into view. The Aurora lay at the third mooring, a 3-masted bark with her hull painted black and a thin gold line running the length of her gunwale. A gangway ran down to the quay. 2 men stood at the foot of it with marlin spikes in their belts, Hale's men. Carrick walked straight up to them as though he had every right in the world, which, as second in command under the lawful captain, he did. The 2 men stepped aside. They had not expected Carrick to be alone. They had certainly not expected Carrick to be followed by the Duke of Pemberton, alive and on his feet, with a woman on his arm. By the time they reached the quarterdeck, the cry had already gone up. Men were boiling out of the forecastle. Some had hammers, some had knives. Most had nothing but their fists. The 24 did not need to be told which side they were on. They saw their captain, and they roared. Hale came up from the great cabin with a pistol in each hand. What followed was sharp and ugly and very short. A scuffle broke out at the foot of the mainmast, where 4 of Hale's men had been coiling a cable. Lyra, who had spent her childhood on the docks of Wapping waiting for a father who never came home, saw the cargo net hanging from the yardarm above their heads and remembered, in a single clear thought, exactly which line held it. She slipped Silas's arm, ducked across the deck, and cut the line with the small knife she carried in her boot. The net came down on the four of them like a wet blanket on a candle. Silas met Hale at the break of the quarterdeck. They had been friends once. There was no friendship in it now. A pistol cracked, and the ball went wide into the rigging. Silas closed the distance before Hale could fire the second. They went down together against the binnacle, and when they came up, Silas had Hale's own cutlass in his hand, and Hale had his back against the rail. "For Thorn," Silas said, very quiet. Hale dropped the second pistol on the deck. The cheering had not yet died on the deck of the Aurora when the boats came. Lyra saw them first. She had climbed onto the rail by the mizzenmast to watch Carrick's men bind Hale's wrists behind him, and from that vantage she had a clear view across the harbor to the customs quay. 3 longboats were pulling smartly across the water from the direction of the castle, each flying a small blue ensign at the stern. The man in the bow of the leading boat wore the cocked hat and gold-laced coat of a senior officer of the Board of Admiralty. "Silas!" He turned at her voice. He had blood on his cuff from a graze along Hale's cheekbone, and his hair had come loose at the temple. He followed her pointing hand. His face changed. "Crow has sent his friends," he said. "Will they board?" "They will board." Carrick was already at his elbow. "Your Grace, the mooring is yours. Say the word and we cut the cable. The tide will carry us out before they reach the chains." Silas thought about it for perhaps 3 seconds. Lyra watched him do it. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of distances and currents and risks, the captain's mind that her father had once written of in his journals as the cool, small flame at the heart of any good sailor. Then he shook his head. "No, we do not run. If we sail under suspicion now, every port between here and Java will be closed against us. We meet them on this deck, and we settle it here." Carrick blew his breath out hard, but he did not argue. He turned and began bawling orders. Hale was dragged below to the brig. The crew was sent to look like a crew, coiling lines and standing easy and not, on any account, brandishing the marlin spikes that had been in their fists 90 seconds ago. By the time the first longboat bumped against the Aurora's side, the ship looked like any other lawful vessel on the morning tide. The man who came over the rail was Admiral Sir Hubert Lestrange. Lyra had heard his name in Silas's study a dozen times. He was a thin, grey man of 60, with a long jaw and the kind of pale, unblinking eyes that gave away nothing of what went on behind them. 2 captains came aboard behind him, and 4 Marines in red coats with muskets shouldered. "Pemberton," the Admiral said. He did not say, "Your Grace." "We have had word that you are unwell." "I have been unwell. I am no longer." "There are men in London who say otherwise." "There are men in London," said Silas evenly, "who would say I had 3 heads if it meant getting their hands on my ships." The Admiral's pale eyes moved past him and came to rest on Lyra. She was still standing by the mizzenmast in her grey dress, with her cloak about her shoulders and her hair coming down from its pins. She did not lower her eyes. She had not lowered her eyes to a man like this in 2 years. "And the young woman?" "My private secretary. Her name is Miss Lyra Thorne, daughter of Captain Elias Thorne, formerly of Her Majesty's sloop Persephone." A small thing moved at the corner of the Admiral's mouth. Not quite a smile. "Pemberton, we have had a deposition sworn before a magistrate 3 days ago by your former first mate, Mr. Augustus Hale, that you suffer from a violent derangement of the mind, that you see ships in the wallpaper, and that you have placed yourself in the keeping of an unmarried woman of unknown family for the purposes of—" "Where is the deposition?" Silas said. "In my coat." Then I will save you the trouble of reading it. Mr. Hale is at this moment in the brig of this ship under guard, having attempted to put to sea under a forged commission bearing my name. The man who suborned him is a shipping magnate of Mincing Lane called Vivian Crow. I will swear that on a Bible before any magistrate you care to bring me." The Admiral was silent for a long moment. "That is a serious charge, Pemberton. I make it seriously. And the lady?" Silas reached out his hand. Lyra came down from the rail and walked across the deck and put her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, and she felt, through the kid of his glove, that they were not entirely steady. He turned to face the Admiral, with her at his side. "Sir Hubert, I am not mad. I have been ill, and I am recovering, and the woman beside me is the reason I am alive at all. She is the daughter of a Queen's officer who was abandoned by this service 6 years ago, and I will not have her name spoken of in any tone but respect on any deck of mine." He drew from inside his coat a folded sheet of cartridge paper. Lyra knew it without looking. It was a fair copy of the map they had made at Trevorrow, with her father's coordinates set against Silas's own, and the chain of islands drawn in clean, black ink. "This," he said, "is the work of 2 voyages and 2 lifetimes. Captain Thorne began it. I have finished it. Miss Thorne has made it possible. I intend to sail in 3 weeks with her aboard as co-owner of the expedition, her name on the articles beside mine, her share of any profits 1/2. If the board has an objection, the board may put it in writing, and I will answer it from the Spice Islands." The Admiral looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Silas and at Lyra, and at the deck of the Aurora and the 40 quiet men standing at their stations. "Send Mr. Hale up in irons," he said at last. "I will take him with me. The rest is your affair, Pemberton. Godspeed." 3 weeks later, the Aurora slipped her moorings on a morning of high white cloud and a steady wind from the northeast. The whole of Falmouth seemed to have come down to watch her go. Word had travelled, the way word always travelled in a port town. The Duke of Pemberton was sailing east again, and there was a woman aboard whose name was on the articles, and an admiral of the board had stood on her deck and saluted her captain. Half the gossip of England had gathered on the quay in clean shawls and Sunday hats to see the thing for itself. Lyra stood at the rail on the quarterdeck and watched the land begin to slide away. She wore a coat of dark blue wool cut for the sea, with horn buttons and deep pockets, and a small black bonnet tied under her chin. Her father's last letter, much folded, was sewn into the lining over her heart. She had finally answered it that morning. She had written her reply on the back of the same paper in her own small, clean hand, and she had told him she was coming. She did not know whether he would ever read it. She had written it anyway. The houses of Falmouth shrank to the size of children's blocks. The grey castle on the headland passed by on the larboard quarter. The cliffs ran on for a while, dark and broken, and then they too began to fall away into the blue distance, and there was nothing on any side of them but open water and the long curve of the world. Carrick had the deck. He was a different man at sea, easy in his shoulders, a quiet smile in the corner of his eye, calling out his orders in a voice that did not need to be raised. The crew moved about their work with the steady cheerfulness of men who have been paid in full and know their captain has come home to them. Below in the brig, there was no Hale. Hale was in Newgate, awaiting trial, along with Vivian Crow of Mincing Lane, whose 2 ships had been seized at the Pool of London the week before on a warrant sworn by the Duke of Pemberton himself. Silas came up the companion ladder a little after noon. He had been below at the chart table, but he had not come up to give an order or to study the wake. He came up because he wanted to stand beside her, and she knew it before he reached the rail, and she made room. "How is your head?" she said. "Clear. No reefs in the bookcase?" "No reefs at all." He looked out over the water. "It is the strangest thing. The visions are gone. I had thought when we sailed they would come back. They have not. They will not unless you drink the cup again. He turned his head and looked at her sideways. Should I? Not yet. There are coordinates enough on that chart to take us where we are going. If we need more, you will know it. He nodded slowly. For a while, neither of them spoke. The bow lifted to a long Atlantic swell and came down again with a great soft hiss of spray. A gull, the last gull of the English coast, hung above the mainmast on a held wing, and then peeled away and was gone. He reached into his coat and brought out a small object wrapped in a square of dark green velvet. I have a thing for you. She took it. She knew the shape through the cloth before she had unwrapped it. A silver sextant, very old, with the maker's name and a date engraved on the brass arc. Ashford, 1798. It had belonged to his father, who had taught him, and to his grandfather before that. Silas, I cannot. You can. You will use it better than I have. This is the most precious thing you own. Yes, he said, and so I am giving it to the most precious thing I have found. She did not answer for a moment, because her throat had closed. She turned the sextant over in her hands. The brass was warm from his pocket. She thought of her father, standing on another deck, on another sea, looking up at the stars and writing them down in his small, clean hand for a daughter he might never see again. Silas, there is something I have not told you. He waited. The night of the ball, when you fell. The poison in your glass was not put there by Hale. Hale knew it was coming. He did not pour it. Then who? My father. She watched his face. He did not move. He sent it home 4 years ago in a sealed packet to a friend in Wapping, with instructions that it was to reach the cup of the first English captain who came home from the Eastern Archipelago, bearing a chart of the islands he had not been allowed to return to. He believed, you see, that the only way to prove what he had found was to mark another man's eyes with it. The friend was my mother's brother. He gave the packet to me before he died. I carried it into your house in the pocket of my apron for 1 year and 11 months before I used it. The wind ran in the rigging above them. A long, slow minute passed. Lyra, you poisoned me. I marked you, as he was marked. I did not know then what it truly was. I thought it would kill you slowly, and that I would watch. And now? And now I am standing beside you on the deck of your ship with your father's sextant in my hand, sailing east to find mine. He looked at her for a long time. Then, very slowly, he began to smile. Miss Thorne, he said, the deal we made in my bedchamber was the strangest bargain in the history of England, and I would not trade it for the crown. The Aurora dipped her bow to the open sea, and the horizon, blue and clean and without end, opened before them.